Thank you for this beautiful invitation to join you. And thanks to everybody without whom we wouldn't be here. So in the next few minutes, I just want to share with this beautiful audience, this audience of folks from around the world who have been a part of, the incredible economic engines of Procter & Gamble and many other organizations through the network of alums and engaged participants that are gathered here. I want to share with you some thoughts about how this movement that we call Black Lives Matter, which some are calling, the new civil rights movement, what it is and why it matters for all of us. And I think on the one hand, we might say that we don't really need this kind of reminder or this invitation to reflect on what it is and why it matters. But I think, and I'd say that because many people feel like, well, there's consensus. We all know the business case for diversity these days. We saw in the wake of the heightened interest in the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged in May of 2020, following the death in the United States of George Floyd in Minnesota. We certainly saw a worldwide heightened emphasis on the circumstances, conditions, the vulnerabilities that are particularly faced by those who identified as Black, African heritage, members of the worldwide African diaspora. Certainly, this is so within the United States, as the data has shown, and as that particularly horrific incident reminded us all, Blacks are more vulnerable to violence and discrimination in encounters and interactions with official police entities, but not only in encounters with official police. The legacies of race-related oppression, hierarchy, and the politics of a certain kind of identitarian desire for domination over others, as opposed to power over others, as opposed to power with others in a diverse and multicultural world. The legacies of that tension, those old strategies in the midst of a world that is seeking to be reborn, a world in which multiculturalism, multiracialism, the reality of this world as one planet, one human community, is really, in our midst and upon us. And yet, if we're honest, if we're willing to pause and look at the circumstances we find ourselves in, we know that we see the deep entrenchment of, again, those legacies of the structures that we have inherited in various and different ways, wherever we are on the globe and in our different communities and organizations. We have inherited ways in which the legacies of our histories are recreating dynamics around inclusion and exclusion, around who belongs and who doesn't, around who's more preferred and who isn't, that we ignore at our peril. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, which actually, just to say, began in 2013 in the United States, it was inspired by, again, another example of a horrifying, painful incident of violence at the intersection of white and Black in the United States, the killing of young Trayvon Martin, in the wake of which 3 African-American women galvanized and gathered together and created and disseminated the hashtag BLM, Black Lives Matter, in an effort to link up the technologies that we were just talking about, the social media and other platforms, right, that were really engaging of the younger generations. But the BLM hashtag effort was really meant to sort of coalesce these various disparate, often less than well coordinated movements for social justice, to bring them together, to allow a point of focus, and to inspire us all to see how this theme of Black Lives Matter might be relevant wherever we are. I, as a law professor at the University of San Francisco, now for more than 20 years, have seen since 2013, slowly year after year, different ways that this new civil rights movement of Black Lives Matter has invited all of us to think more intentionally and well about what is our role in advancing the cause of multiracial justice and democracy, if you will, wherever we are. What is our role in examining how the legacies of not just racism in general, but anti-Black racism in particular, which is its own phenomenon, wherever we may find ourselves, the inquiry will be, what are the legacies of anti-Black racism, the particular ways that the idea, as we do know, the social scientists tell us that race is this social construction, the way we think about race, the way we think about the idea of Blackness and the bodies that we associate it with. How is it that those biases, stereotypes, again, the legacies of, the worldwide systems of enslavement, colonialism, and segregation and racial hierarchy, how are those legacies impacting who we serve and how we serve? How are they impacting how we measure merit, which is, again, the gateway to getting people into our organizations? Since the George Floyd murder, corporations came out around the world announcing new initiatives, new commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion. Again, the business case for more diverse workplaces having been made and remade and disseminated and redisseminated, and yet actually changing workplaces, actually increasing and making more diverse our workplaces has often stalled. And so organizations, including PG&E, announced goals for improving workforce diversity. PG&E announced a goal of having Blacks, for example, comprise 13% of its U.S. workforce. That figure was 10% in last June of 2020. And a current analysis by the Marketplace organization indicated that figure remained at 10%. Blacks continue to comprise only 10% of the U.S. workforce in 2021. How can that be? Again, how is it and why is it that our efforts to make good on our goals, values, and commitments around diversity, equity, inclusion are often not followed up with action, right? And so really what I want to sort of focus us in on here is a kind of, I guess I want a call to action, frankly. I mean, we know that that working to really make good on the promises that we make around equity in a world where, as has just been mentioned, inequality is being driven by technology. We know the legacies of the coronavirus at this time have disproportionately impacted communities of color wherever we are. And what it looks like where you are may be very different from what it looks like for me in San Francisco as a Black racialized woman who grew up here in the U.S., where the legacies of racism and sexism were very clear in the lives of people like me. And yet, because of action, because of committed efforts to change law and policy and how we did what we were doing, people like me, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, went to a beautiful university, University of Virginia, in the 1980s, where companies like P&G recruited. And so I know from my own experience that when organizations and a society and cultures and communities deepen commitments and then follow through with actions in a sustained and accountable way, change can happen. I wouldn't be here if that weren't true. And yet, in the United States, while we had a period of focus on real change with real accountability measures and the willingness to, put numbers, goals, and timetables on the horizon, and actually then measure how we're doing. When we had those efforts and commitments in place, and the accountability metrics to follow, change happens. Again, I wouldn't be here without it. However, once we pull back on that kind of commitment, once we stop being willing to actually look at the data and actually ask ourselves the hard questions, why is there a gap between the statements that we make and what we're actually doing? When we fail to do that kind of accountability work, our actual efforts to transform the world around equity and to promote Black justice and equity in particular often falter. Because again, those dynamics, the systemic drivers of inequality are very, very powerful. They do not change without real action. And so, Black Lives Matter is really inviting us all to think about how, wherever we are, our own commitments might be strengthened. Our values have been stated. How do we act more consistently and pervasively in alignment with the values and commitments that we have broadcast around the world? These commitments matter. They're not just words. And the efforts we might make to ensure that, Black people who, depending on the data that we look at, are some 20% of the world's population, are sharing in the benefits of our global, this moment of opportunity, and including these new moments that we're facing in the post-pandemic world. So these things matter for all of us, and it's not easy to stay committed to the work of change. This is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Strengthening Our Communities Through Mindfulness, because I know it's not easy. I know I've seen it in my own experience as a law professor. It's very easy to have goals, values, policies, even new laws, and then to look out and see that the society that we've created has not changed very much. The communities haven't changed very much. Our workplaces haven't. And so the difficulty seems to lie often in what our previous speaker was talking about, the underlying fears, the underlying anxieties that can come with change. And so one of the ways that I've been working with many others around the world, starting in the US, starting in law, to deepen our capacity for the hard conversations and the predictable conflicts that will come as we try to enact social change, has been through the inclusion of a view of what equity requires that is fully holistic, not just about programmatic and operational changes and strategic initiatives that we can reduce to our public, statements and place on our websites, but really a holistic engagement. Who are we as we seek to implement these sorts of values and goals and objectives? How are we hiring, promoting, and deepening our capacity to mentor and develop talent in ways that through and through embody our commitment to inclusivity? How are we holding people accountable for the accomplishments of those objectives in ways that show up in bonuses and measurements, in the very different ways that we measure merit once folks are hired? And so these are the harder, aspects of really making good on these promises that I'm here to kind of shine a light on and maybe amp up the energy, kind of put a challenge out there to each of you who is listening to my voice now. We have these stated values and commitments to equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. They are all over the place in corporate America and have been for years. We just heard P&G talking, or we've just heard of companies here in this conversation so far. And of course, P&G and its global network is a part of that, talking about the ways that commitment has extended over the decades. And yet I'll say 30 years ago when I was at the University of Virginia, it was a moment of taking a little bit of a kind of a victory lap. We've got people like me were there. And for many corporations and entities, the energy kind of dissipated for a while to actually keep measuring how we were doing. And I'll say that San Francisco, where I now live, I wouldn't live here actually if the Bar Association of San Francisco, I went to law school after undergraduate school, like many probably on this call, if the Bar Association of San Francisco had not had specific goals and timetables through which they said, we'll go to places like the University of Virginia, where I was, University of Michigan, where my partner was, who is a South Asian American man who's working as a lawyer in San Francisco now. The Bar Association said, listen, we're going to diversify this bar. We're going to find the people that we know who can succeed, who wouldn't be thinking about San Francisco, and bring them here. And I'm not saying this is the only way to make good on our commitments, but it does indicate a kind of specific way that we use the tool of goals and timetables. We're going to diversify by this time. We're going to devote, billions of dollars were stated, right? Companies have pledged more than $1 billion in efforts to follow up on racial equity following the George Floyd murder last year and the worldwide outpouring of support for Black Lives Matter. But again, a year on, we're looking at maybe 250 million or so has been expensed. Not a bad start, but not the billions of dollars that actually had been pledged. And again, efforts appear to stall in many different ways. So wherever you are, the question is, how are we making good on those commitments? How are we building that mindset for agility and for constantly reinventing ourselves that our previous speaker just spoke about? What are the concrete ways that we're seeing the links between mindset support, developing coaching for excellence, and wellness, which has also been highlighted as a theme? Seeing the connections between our commitments to wellness, excellence, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism is essential. We should no longer even have measures of success, whether for our particular institutions, or the workplaces, our teams, or this broader, beautiful economic community of which we're all a part in the global sense. There should no longer be notions of success that are not first and foremost about commitment to ensuring equity and fairness in the distribution of the benefits of these beautiful systems of and tremendous economic engines of which we're all a constituent part. And so if we are going to continue to make good on the promises of this moment in the world post-pandemic, where actually, despite all of the difficulty that many of us have been facing, many of our communities have suffered, and again, communities of color have disproportionately suffered in many places, including here in the United States. We do have this opportunity to make a difference. And the good news is, in my own humble experience, when we focus on the actual fears, the actual anxieties that each of us is facing, when we recognize that, yes, there is in this moment a kind of a renewed interest in identitarian politics, in sort of a kind of nationalism that would kind of revivify these ideas of inclusion and exclusion, of building walls and keeping people out, the kind of pull toward those old ways of thinking about how we are in relationship to one another is present. And so how we meet this moment, how we galvanize and organize and energize ourselves to amplify the values of inclusion, to amplify the possibility for navigating these waters in ways that draw on our deepest resources for working well together in collaboration and in solidarity with, as opposed to in domination over. Speaking directly those values and living them has never been more important. And seeing the connections between sustainability, climate sustainability, That includes all of us and does not provide another place where we see these inequalities playing out. Seeing the link between public health, we see that racism is being declared worldwide as a public health problem. And we know what that means when we look at some of the ways that, again, COVID disproportionately impacted people who were traditionally vulnerable to racism. We know that this is a difficulty that we experience in terms of actually making good on the promises. But we do know, research has begun to show actually, that practices like mindfulness are not only practices that support us in focusing, dealing with stress, achieving our productivity goals, but these practices, if delivered in a particular kind of way, can assist us in going right into the difficulty of making our workplaces and our communities places where we can all feel welcome, places where we can all feel our inherent belonging on the planet. You know, my feeling is we wouldn't be here if we didn't already belong. And yet many of us find ourselves struggling to feel a sense of belonging wherever we are. We've migrated from some place or another, and we're struggling to feel a sense that our lives matter right where we are. The truth is, all of our lives do matter. And whatever might be getting in the way of really expanding the benefits of these beautiful economic systems and engines so that people and communities are not left behind, we must double down on our efforts to do that. And that's the challenge I'm putting to everyone within the hearing of my voice. This is all of our challenge, because the way in which my community survives and thrives during this era is inevitably connected with yours. We now know that is one world, and that the vulnerabilities I face actually are related to the life and lives and opportunities that you, wherever you are, face in ways that may not be seen. We may not be able to see this, but know that that is so. And therefore, everything that we can do to minimize these rising inequities that we continue to see is something worthy of our efforts. So I just want to pause there and invite you, wherever you are, to take a moment, take a deep breath, and sense what is coming up for you as I share these words. Think about the way in which your own workplace, your own community, your own life has taught you something about the struggle to make good on these promises of inclusion that we are speaking to in our corporate environments. What do you know about the difficulty you face right where you are? And how can you make a new and renewed commitment to doing what you can personally, interpersonally, and systemically to make the world a much more inclusive place for us all? I'm here to help in any way that I can. My name is Rhonda Magee, and I really appreciate and feel heartened by the fact that we have had this moment and that you have chosen to incorporate this call to reflect on the mattering of Black lives, and as a part of the mattering of all our lives on a planet where absolutely everything is connected. Because when Black lives matter, actually all of our lives will. So I thank you very, very much for all that you are and all that you're doing right now and all that you may do to exercise leadership and exercise the power that you have. No matter what your official position in any hierarchy, we all have power to make a difference here. And may we make a difference from where we are that the world will be able to see from this moment forward. Thank you very much.